Hello and welcome to another video in our instalment of Realist Evaluation workshop videos. Today we're going to be focusing on communicating our findings to relevant audiences, and we're very lucky to have our guest here today, Dr. Rob Southall-Edwards, a research fellow from the University of Suffolk, who's going to join us and talk about some of his experiences. So I don't know, Rob, do you want to just briefly mention your previous experience at Active Essex?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Hi, I'm Rob. Previously, before I moved on to the University of Suffolk, I spent a year working at Active Essex as a member of the Insight and Evaluation team, working on the evaluation of the local delivery pilot.
Awesome, thank you. So in terms of communicating findings, this might mean different things to different people, but from almost a traditional sense of use, some of the key things that have come up in conversations, we often find that actually, well, how do people communicate their findings? Through reports, whether it's a short, easy to access report or a longer academic report with greater findings, peer-reviewed journals, again looking from a slightly academic point of view where people will look to publish their findings, presentations, and I guess this is very common in terms of whether it's meetings, group projects, away days, back in your days as a student, presenting the findings back, an opportunity for people to discuss, maybe social media, which we'll explore a little bit more in terms of how we share potentially more positive findings, as well as infographics and visual tools, easy aids that we can bring up to display some of the key headlines of the findings, especially trying to involve people that potentially won't want to read through a full report, but can take an infographic and discuss it from there. Now, Rob, I guess it'd be great to understand, what do we actually want from our findings, and potentially your experience with Active Essex or in other roles? Do some of these things on the screen right now resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. I think what do you want from the findings depends on who you are. So it's who is that, who's taking those findings and looking to use them. Certainly as a researcher, I think I want to increase knowledge, and I did my time there in the role, and help solve problems, inform evidence-based decision making, which I think is part of that. I think equally, I can see on their kind of validation funding, there are parts of findings that are used because they're required to support, as part of funding that was awarded, there are requirements to produce particular reports or outputs that are almost completed as part of that.
In terms of funding, Rob, do you ever think it's a challenge that could potentially cause the conflict of like making sure our findings support future funding as opposed to increasing our knowledge or solving problems?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point. If you've been awarded funding and just say hypothetically you complete a project and there are some challenges, so it doesn't go perfectly, if you're very transparent in sharing that knowledge and reporting on that, I think that could definitely have implications for then using that to help support kind of getting more funding. So I think it's one of the kind of challenges with the way that funding is often awarded.
Yeah, it's definitely the political pressures, the diplomatic pressures within organisations, whether it's charity, volunteer, local authority. I think that funding is always important, keeping people in jobs, and how can we use our learnings, even if it's not potentially going back to the funders, for other areas of the business and for other projects, for other delivery, other initiatives. And I think one of the positive things we see in some delivery projects at the minute, such as local delivery pilot, that there is that bit more freedom around, actually you don't have to get X amount of people active, but you just have to support people. So there's that freedom in terms of, increasing our knowledge. We've got an opportunity to do this with the funding we've got to then go out and impact on people's lives around physical activity and some of the barriers to being active.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, because that's ultimately what I think you want to try and do with it, isn't it?
Yeah, have use that learning for an impact. some of the examples in practice, so team away days was one we talked about before, Rob, in terms of how you used some of your learnings and some of the evaluation data in your role at Active Essex. Could you share a little bit about how you did that?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, firstly, kind of sharing data from the evaluation I was working on, often through sort of workshop format away days, was something novel to me. You know, I hadn't done that before. We were seeing that as a new way to try and share and engage people. And I think it was one of the examples of how I think I did successfully share data with the kind of wider team and get engagement from them while I was there. So a good example would be, I remember there was a literature review completed on an area, you know, that's quite even condensed, it's quite a sort of heavy text-based document. We actually found a good way to turn that into some questions and create a workshop activity that we could then do with the team, which was a really good way of making the information more digestible. And then we're also able to put some kind of practical elements in there, like ask people, okay, how can you use this in your work? You know, how is this going to change what you do day to day? And it felt like people could then really understand how that information was useful to them. And then that would obviously potentially have a chance to impact what they were doing on a day-to-day basis.
I think it's really interesting to see about how you go and say, what we've done all this work, we've done all this evaluation, we've got all this data, but how do you want it? How does it work for you? Like, it may be about those people's programs, but actually, how do they digest it? How do they take it? And it's really cool to see that it's done in a different way. It's not just a case of, well, here are the facts, now go and do it, but trying to make it a bit more engaging and involved, that they can take some ownership over it as well. And it's something that we like to explore with whether it's stories of change or case studies, around actually getting people to try and collect those case studies themselves, collect some data themselves, so that when we talk about sharing the findings, say a project officer would be able to easily share the findings because they played a huge part in collecting that data. They sat down with the person, they talked to them, asked them questions, and really helped to produce that case study, so that when it comes to the learning, they've done that themselves. They're not relying on someone else to translate the findings for them or try to interpret their words. And I think that also plays into the power of stories, where people could talk about how they changed, or how a program changed or caused change, and something that can then be shared as well, because it's relatable, it's personable, it's real, it's not theoretical. If we do this, then this will happen because of this. It's rather a case of, well, this participant experienced this in being involved, and this is what has happened as a result, and this is the key learnings of the mechanisms involved in impacting this change. Actually, let's take that story and say, well, we'd like to support these people in a different project. What are some of the key learnings we can take from the methods used, rather than just that outcome? I think the other one we wanted to talk about was the opportunity to talk at conferences, whether it's academic, whether it's just around physical activity in terms of what we've looked at, but just to share and understand that lots of people are trying to translate their knowledge in different ways, whether that's the opportunity to present at the conference, or whether it's just going along and asking questions of people and being like, you know what, that's a similar problem we've had, or we've faced this challenge. Can we take it on board from them? Oh, how did they do it? How did they involve others? Slightly negative, I guess, in terms of the pitfalls of potentially sharing an evaluation. And we talked about it in terms of funding. If we're reliant on funding, people might not be as open because of the findings not supporting what is needed. And it's something that it's not just about that could potentially put people off engaging or sharing an evaluation. And Rob, it'd be great to get your thoughts on whether you agree or disagree, or some examples around like the language or the accessibility of potential evaluation reports or evaluation findings.
Yeah, I mean, definitely historically with sort of evaluation work, and I'm not meaning at my my time at Active Essex per se, I'm meaning sort of more generally in evaluation, you know, reports are produced, and I don't think these are that accessible. As we've discussed, this might be because there was a kind of requirement as funding to produce that kind of report, but it's probably not the right format to present the information in to the audience you're looking to gain engagement from. I think a challenge is sometimes there isn't even a one size fits all. You need to produce different outputs for different groups that you're trying to engage with. And you mentioned the language, and I totally agree. The language you use is really important. It's not that people don't understand some of the more technical language I think that can be used. It's, I'd say, more from my experience, that there's just certain language and terminology that's kind of seen as very academic and very kind of not real world jargon, and that can just disengage some people. And if you can find a way to not do that, I think it's a good point for starting to engage with some wider audiences.
Yeah, it's definitely a key one in terms of engaging not just the key funders or strategic decision makers in commissioning and evaluation, but some of the key stakeholders, whether they're participants or delivery partners. What terminology do they use? Can we align it with that? Is there a case where lots of different partners use different terminology for the same thing? Is that something that could come up within the evaluation as well? So we always talk about a collaborative approach to evaluation and bringing people involved, community members, all the way up to policy holders. So actually, can we engage with them from the beginning? And I think that goes on to the point about not engaging with stakeholders. If we can engage with them from the beginning, we can then keep them involved in the process, update them, and share key findings with them. One of the key points I wanted to talk about, Rob, was the selective reporting, the taking some information potentially out of context and sharing that as a positive story, a success story, when actually it's not necessarily potentially doesn't align with the full evaluation itself.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken to some of the reasons you might do this, with particular regard to things like funding, where, I mean, I don't think I've ever come across a funder asking you to tell them about times you did things and it didn't work, and you know, essentially that in a way it didn't kind of get what they were looking for from their money, even though there's obviously a lot of learning in that. I think this kind of system that you operate within historically supports that idea of kind of focusing on, I don't want to say the good, but kind of the positive stories, because these are often then linked with helping you gain more funding or support from others or people more willing to work with you, etc. in the future. And often, I certainly think as a researcher, some of the most beneficial information that comes out of things is actually the examples of where you tried something, it didn't work as you thought, there were a lot of challenges, but now you can take that learning forward and you won't do it again, which I think is a great thing, but I'm not sure we're quite at a point yet where the kind of, again, the system we operate in necessarily really does appreciate that or rewards you working in that way. So it definitely presents a challenge.
Yeah, and I think that is a challenge that's continuously faced, isn't it? And trying to make those small little wins throughout of changing attitudes or behaviours. But ultimately, if say funding comes from a pot that just demands success, it's not much wiggle room and can be quite demoralising for evaluation partners or those conducting the evaluation.
Yeah, and I think intuitively as well, especially in kind of physical activity environments where you get a lot of people, I think, come from sporting backgrounds and things like that. People are quite competitive in nature. And so it's natural also to want to focus on the kind of good or the wins, because that's just kind of ingrained in the kind of culture they come from.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in terms of communicating these reports to relevant audiences, like what can we do and what can we stop doing? So considering the language we use, Rob talked about that a lot in terms of, is it off-putting? Is it going to stop people straight away? visualization. Can we make things look good in terms of when we read it, people can actually understand what it means, rather than having a body of text, an image or something that's supportive that can be taken away and considered in that aspect. Where and when do we share it? Is the week before Christmas the best time to share information, or is there an opportunity where everyone comes together as a public network or a forum, and everyone's in the same room and there's an opportunity to then discuss it and share it and feedback afterwards? And then relationships with these audiences. We know that in active ethics, there's some really good relationships going on between staff and the community, as with many of the local delivery pilots. And I'm sure there is across public health and lots of different sectors. So actually, if there's that positive relationship with these audiences, is it going to help have these difficult conversations potentially, but also just sharing these outputs, especially for participants of the project? And crediting those involved, I think it's really important that everyone that's involved with it, whether it's sourcing people to interview or just contributing to some of the terminology that's going to be used to kind of make it everyone's business, and to foster that thinking of evaluation, that if we can bring people in and say, you know what, you're a big part of this, you played a key role, we want you to continue to do this, that credit can be really important. And then show the process from the beginning. I think, Rob, in terms of especially realist evaluation, this how and why thinking, could it sometimes put people off if we talk about the methodology of an evaluation for, say, participants? Or do we just involve them in terms of the conversations and collect data from them, as long as they know it's an evaluation and they've got the consent forms, anything like that? Do they need to know the whole process?
I think sometimes they don't. I would agree that kind of being overly transparent about your kind of detailed methodology, which you're obviously using because you want to ensure that you're kind of doing a proper, rigorous process, definitely does switch some people off. I think a great example is this. I think during my time there at Activated, I remember presenting information always backwards to people and kind of giving them the results first, or kind of what you got out of it, and then telling them how you got it. And I feel like people are more interested in how you got the information once they'd kind of had the information already. If I'd done it the other way around, they might have switched off and then not heard the second part.
Yeah, fully agree. Fully agree. I'm sure there'll be some people that will take a bit of it and potentially lead on with it. But I guess it goes back to knowing your audience. Is it potentially something you could have that conversation with them at some point? And then next steps, actually, what's going to happen after the evaluation? Is it a case of pop it on the shelf, it's done? Or are we going to sit down and say, right, how is this going to inform future processes, future learning, future actions? What can we stop? Use of jargon. I think that would be happy for everyone across the whole of the world, not just for evaluation, but for everything. Word count. Now, Rob, it'd be really interesting to get your point. Sometimes we need a lot of detail in there, don't we? But is that putting people off? Do we water down our evaluations to get more people to access them, or does that impact on our integrity?
Yeah, I think sometimes word count is definitely an issue. I get that sometimes you have to produce things that do have a lot of detail in there. There's been a lot of work that has occurred, but there are definitely times I think you need to. I mean, it's not just word count; it's kind of how you convey the information. I think even if it's short, kind of getting away from that old style like word report is something that we can stop doing. I think people engage more with things, as you said, in what can we do that are more visual, infographics, booklets, putting things into kind of presentation formats. It's kind of how do we present things more condensed, but equally there might be times that, again, you've got to know the audience, and there's certain times that we do need to produce a really sort of long traditional report because that's what's required of us, and in those instances we have to do that. But then perhaps that isn't what we then go and share with other audience involved in that project. We need to produce something more appropriate for them apart from that.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think share and forget are quite often things will be presented and never spoken about again. Avoiding the negatives. There's always that case of actually, are we being funded to do this evaluation? Should we just focus on the positives so that we can keep everyone happy? And to finish off, thank you to everyone that's tuned in to listen. We wanted to make you aware of the collaborative approach to evaluation that we often take part in, the Schuler et al. 2015 model. Some of the principles to guide collaborative approaches to evaluation. So definitely recommend going away and looking at this, or watching the longer video produced, where we talk a little bit more in detail, just some ideas around how you can potentially then be more collaborative with your approaches to evaluation, how you can involve stakeholders, community members, so that it's easier to share the findings. It's hopefully easier to have those conversations around the negatives, or about the best way to present things to different audiences as well. Rob, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been lovely to catch up with you, and yeah, hope everyone enjoys.
Thanks for having me.